You good? All right. Well, thank you everyone for waiting, and good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mariana Orlandi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family Culture. And first of all, I want to thank you all for finding the time, finding parking, making sometimes comfortable stuff. For those of you, probably few, but some, that never heard about us, about the Austin Institute before, and there are some new faces. I just wanted to give you a very, very brief idea of what the Austin Institute is and what's its mission, so as an introduction to the talk of today. So the Austin Institute is an entity that I would say has two souls. The first one is that of our research institute, that, as our name reveals, focuses on the family and on human relationships. And as such, we promote and support research, surveys, conferences on these topics, both nationally and internationally. The second soul is that of an organization that wants to bring its research to all the students and to the young professionals and older professionals too, who want to learn how to live a truly flourishing life, and not just in practice, but in not just in theory, but in practice. So a family and a stable marriage are certainly central to a good life, but there's a lot more about human flourishing. A lot of things that our culture of extreme individualism, overwhelming fluidity, efficiency, technology, so many things that our culture has forgotten. So with those who attend our events, book clubs, our talks, or fellowships, we try to compensate for this lack, for this forgetfulness of the things that matter most. And we try to think together about all the things that matter in order to live a truly wholesome life. And so some of the faces in the room have benefited largely from our programs. And what they usually say, including last night at a book club, is that the Institute provided them with an intellectual community that also felt like a family. So if you need either or both, you may have found your place, and I strongly encourage you to sign up for one of our programs based on your age range. There is absolutely something for you: undergrads, grads, young professionals, older professionals, everything. And while we're not affiliated with UT, our events are mainly geared towards UT students, and our president, Professor Mark Minister, and two of our senior fellows, including Professor Buczewski, are, as you know, UT professors. So thanks to also the collaboration with the Salem Center here at UT, we also get the chance a couple of times per semester to have some talks posted on UT campus. So today is one of those days, it's one of those occasions. And today we're bringing to you a professor of architecture whose scholarship is definitely animated, I guess I would know, by the same questions, and perhaps also largely by the same vision that animates the work of the Austin Institute. Professor Philip Best is a distinguished professor of architecture at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches graduate urban design and theory, and is particularly interested in the Catholic and classical humanist, intellectual, and artistic traditions and their relationship to modern American life. He cares about how cities and buildings may or may not contribute to human flourishing, and to us reaching somehow our ultimate ends. And this is, or at least this is how I understand his work. He has written extensively on these topics, which he understands better than others, also because he studied philosophy as an undergraduate and then church history at the graduate level too. And today, he will help us understand how a modern city, perhaps a city like Austin, may promote or obstruct our own flourishing as human beings. And maybe how Austin may do a better job in the future and in the days to come. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Best, for accepting the invitation to come, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should say that this is a long-term cultural project that I'm talking about here. Good afternoon, and thanks to everybody for coming. I would say that Austin has occupied my imagination since at least 1963, owing to its football successes under Darrell Royal and its intense rivalries with Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Alabama. Their 1963 national championship, the Longhorns, and perhaps most memorably in the 1965 Orange Bowl, when the Longhorns defeated the Joe Namath-led Crimson Tide 21-17 with a magnificent and memorable goal line stand late in the fourth quarter in what was the first major bowl game played at night. So how times change. I later learned of UT's magnificent Paul Craig campus plan, and later still became as enamored of Austin city limits as everyone else. But in spite of all that, this is my first visit to Austin, so I'm delighted to be here, and delighted as well to find myself among friends, both old and new. So I therefore want to thank the Austin Institute for this invitation, and especially hostess straordinaria, Mariana Orlandi. Hostess straordinaria, that's Italian for hostess with the mostest, who got the ball rolling, and to Pablo for helping to facilitate my visit. For more than 30 years, the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, which I teach, has characterized itself variously as a classical school, a traditional school, and sometimes as a classical and traditional school, but generally employing the word traditional in ways that might reasonably cause others to think that we presume traditional to be an unambiguous and universally beloved word synonymous with good. We do recognize, of course, that not everyone holds traditions in as high regard as we do, and yet our sometimes heroic persistence in embracing traditions as at least potential goods sometimes also has the effect of distracting us excuse me, from actually making some of the arguments required to define and defend traditions and their implications. Therefore, before I show the two Notre Dame studio projects that I have arranged for you, the larger Metropolitan and its neighborhood scaled coda, the larger scale Metropolitan project and its neighborhood scaled coda, I want to say something succinct, maybe not that succinct because I think the second slide is like 4 pages in. I want to say something succinct about traditions and their implications, offered less as axioms than as inductively derived premises that inform the rest of my presentation. So there are 3. The first is that reality is intelligible and human beings can know reality truly, with the necessary qualification that any true knowledge we acquire is at best always partial by virtue of both our finitude and our misshapen desires. And most importantly for my purposes today, available to us only via the mediation of historical traditions. Second is that there are 2 kinds of people: those who participate in traditions more or less happily and know it, and those who participate in traditions more or less happily and don't know it. And then third, it's that some traditions are good and some traditions are not so good, which should lead us, but too rarely does, toward a fundamental question about both architecture and ourselves. What do we mean by good and not so good? And though we all really do think most of the time in terms of good and not so good, about architecture and many, many, many other things, it is striking how both contemporary architectural discourse and practice alike seem persistently unwilling to contemplate architecture in anything other than terms either emotivist or libertarian, and by failing to articulate architecture's primary ends and subordinate means, thereby elide the question of what is good, and also, of course, what is beautiful. For many moderns, particularly those of artistic temperament, tradition exists at best in tension with and at worst opposed to innovation. And the subject of innovation within a tradition necessarily raises some subsidiary questions about how to understand both rationality and authority within the context of traditions. So herewith to begin, some thoughts about reason, authority, and innovation in the context of good traditions of architecture. The argument is broadly Aristotelian in its substance, confirmed with differing details by historic architectural practice and theory, but is here stated in a form specifically indebted to a passage from Alistair MacIntyre's Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, based on his Gifford Lectures of 1988. Here then is my architectural gloss on MacIntyre. This is like 2 pages. So standards of excellence within any culture of building, properly characterized as a good tradition, are both derived and justified historically, and generally applied to at least 4 categories related to the built environment. First, exceptional works of architecture. Second, durable and decorous vernacular buildings. Third, some implied or explicit attitude toward the spatial character of human settlements, large and small, under the rubric of urban design. And fourth, some formal interest in landscape design that originated in but has transcended agriculture and or other kinds of land stewardship. Such standards of excellence have emerged from critical engagement of preceding standards of excellence and are justified because and insofar as the current standards have remedied the defects and transcended the limitations of their predecessors as guides to excellent achievement within that particular tradition. Every good tradition of building is informed by some conception of perfected work, which serves as the shared telos, the end or purpose of that tradition. And what come to be regarded and characterized as the most excellent works of building and urban space making so far are judged so because they stand in some determinate relationship to that telos. Reasoning within a good tradition of building, therefore, differs from the reasoning of modernist rationalism on the one hand and postmodern emotivism on the other. Modernist architectural theorists presented arguments on behalf of putatively necessary built forms suited to their industrial age. And in the modernist understanding, such arguments would be recognized as rationally compelling to any intelligent person who understood the allegedly necessary direction of early 20th century history. However, for the cold-eyed Nietzschean postmodernists who have succeeded the modernists, there are no rational arguments that do not mask arbitrary expressions of the will to power. Rationality itself is either self-deception or a ploy, ultimately an illusion, if not a sham, and if postmodern architectural design has a telos, it is to make novel forms of buildings that have never before been seen. Nevertheless, 2 characteristics shared both by modernists and postmodernists are, first, a disinterest in history, save at most a grab bag of aesthetic motifs that might or might not be related to some specific context. And second, an agreement that a tradition itself can never be a guide to artistic excellence. In contrast, persons who knowingly participate in good traditions of building understand reason, authority, and innovation differently. Simply because at any particular moment, the rationality of a good tradition of building oriented to standards of excellence is justified by its history so far, to share in the rationality of a good tradition requires sharing in the contingencies of its history, understanding the tradition's story as one's own, and finding a place for oneself as a character in the enacted dramatic narrative, which is that tradition's history so far. In a good tradition of building, a participant is rational qua participant insofar as he or she conforms to the best standards of productive reason developed so far. And the rationality in which he or she thus shares is always therefore understood as a historically situated rationality. And this is true even if it aims at a timeless formulation of its own standards, which would be their final and perfected form through a series of successive reformulations past and yet to come. That sentence, that last minute was, I think, all one sentence. But I'm at my second slide. So here we go. We're off and running now. That final and perfected form would, and I'm still on the summary here, that final and perfected form would be understood by all Orthodox Christians as an eschatological gift. And by some Christians, including Catholics, would also be understood as sacramental. And my point in showing this image of the Ghent altarpiece is not that it is or must be the greatest painting in the history of Western art, though it is arguably a contender, but because it reveals specifically the eschatological and sacramental character of perfected artistic form, which is to say, the transcendent horizon arguably required for any enduring tradition of great art and architecture and urban design. This begins to explain the place of innovation in the context of a tradition. The authority of a master within a good tradition of building is both more and other than a matter of exemplifying the best standards so far. It is also, and most importantly, a matter of knowing how to go farther, and especially how to direct others towards going farther, using what can be learned from the tradition afforded by the past to move towards the telos of fully perfected buildings, cities, and landscapes. It is in thus knowing how to link past and future that those with authority are able to draw upon the tradition to interpret and reinterpret the tradition so that its directedness towards its telos becomes apparent in new and characteristically unexpected ways. And it is by the ability to teach others how to learn this type of knowing how that the power of a master within a good community of traditional building is legitimated as rational authority. Okay, deep breath. So it's with this understanding of rational authority that I'm back now. It's with this understanding of rational authority within good traditions in pursuit of a telos that both has a history and is directed toward some perfected ideal that I want to share with you two Notre Dame School of Architecture graduate student architecture and urban design projects undertaken in and for the present and pending urban, environmental, and economic ruins of the American built environment. One is at the scale of a modern metropolitan region covering 4,000 square miles. And the other is at the scale of one and a half city blocks covering 8 acres. And part of my reason is to argue that there is a lost tradition of architecture, broadly understood, that can comprehend and address the issues entailed by human placemaking at each scale, running from regional land use to the physical form of cities, towns, and villages, and their component networks of streets and blocks, to the construction of high and low new buildings, and the preservation of high and low old buildings. And by high and low, I don't mean tall and short, I mean monumental and vernacular. This architectural tradition can be characterized loosely but substantively as classical humanist. But a good tradition by any other name would smell as rosy. Both of the projects I'm going to show are skeptical of the merits and future of our modern industrial culture of construction. Our present model of building construction at an increasingly global scale has relied on growing quantities of industrial produced, high embodied energy materials, including putatively eco-friendly high-tech practices, high-tech products, requiring complex processes of mineral extraction and processing, material assemblage, manufacture, and transportation. The increasingly apparent consequence, supported by an increasingly visible body of evidence, is that our post-1950 built environment is neither resilient nor sustainable, either economically or environmentally, nor is it beautiful enough to warrant the affection that might inspire economic sacrifice to preserve it. And this calls to mind Stein's law, articulated by Herbert Stein in the mid-1980s. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Now, yes, thank you, we're going there. So now, for context, Stein was being both serious and ironic. And part of his irony was directed against alarmists who were thinking that because something cannot go on forever, the time to stop it is now, immediately, and sometimes by any means necessary. And while I appreciate the truth of Stein's law and am sympathetic to Stein's sentiment, I do think that if ruinous things are happening that should not continue, even if they are popular, neither civilizational collapse nor political revolution are necessarily the most desirable courses of amelioration. The two projects that follow are intended as examples of serious but less drastic ameliorative alternatives. Renewing an authentic human ecology that both nourishes the human soul and is consonant with our vocation as stewards of creation seems a daunting long-term cultural project that nevertheless must largely occur, arguably can only occur, in situ. Multiple steadfast exercises of justice, prudence, and aesthetic judgment, both individual and collective, appropriate to Max Weber's famous pre-power tool characterization of politics as, quote, a slow boring of hard boards, quote. But some of the work of this cultural project must arguably be visionary. For the past decade at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, I've worked with a select group of graduate and undergraduate urban design students to imagine metropolitan Chicago together and separately at the bicentennial of Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago, like one of the great visionary documents, certainly historically, but certainly in America, the history of American city planning. Drawing on classical humanist traditions of architecture and urban design and principles of Catholic social teaching, we at Notre Dame are. My studios were, not Daniel Burnham, although he was conversant with it. Drawing on these classical humanist tradition of architecture and urban design and principles of Catholic social teaching, looking both backward and forward, our ambition has been to envision Chicago in 2109 as a flourishing agrarian urban unit, a neo-Aristotelian polis at metropolitan scale. But even at metropolitan scale, characterized by beauty, solidarity, subsidiarity, environmental stewardship, and good law. A metropolis that both anticipates and sacramentally participates in the heavenly Jerusalem that in the Catholic understanding of reality is the very telos of creation itself. The Chicago 2109 project was prompted by a general dismay at what today's most prominent architecture and urbanism have become, by a specific sadness about Chicago as a global city with a globally recognized skyline, at the same time bleeding population and teetering on the edge of financial insolvency into which it is surely going to plunge. And finally, by the tendentious ideological character of the Chicago architectural establishment's observance in 2009 of the centennial of the Plan of Chicago. Basically, they completely dissed Daniel Burnham. And so Chicago 2109 was undertaken for several reasons. First, to critique what Chicago has become 100 years after Burnham and Bennett's Plan of Chicago. Second, to critique the original Plan of Chicago itself. And here, one of the most famous epigrams to come out of that is Daniel Burnham's comment, "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood," which is, there's a certain truth to that, but the problem is that every megalomaniacal project to come down the pike in the last 100 years in Chicago is quoting this aphorism of Daniel Burnham. So part of it is we want to critique that and change it slightly. This is Daniel Burnham from Purgatory, who's advising, make no bad plans, rather make good plans. Big ones? Yes, but with lots of room for communal and individual actors. So the third objective is to envision Chicago at the bicentennial of the plan and what Chicago might look like in 2109 by beginning with Chicago as it exists in the present, but guided over the next century, now 90 years, by the holistic vision and classical humanist sensibilities of the 1909 plan of Chicago as an authoritative reference point. I also thought at the time that Notre Dame's School of Architecture was uniquely positioned to undertake a project of this sort, both because the classical humanist architectural sensibilities were deeply embedded in the school, and also because these sensibilities could be grounded in the sacramental culture and metaphysical realist assumptions of the larger university community, in which moral and cultural relativism do not completely reign, and where the objective character of beauty, goodness, and truth remain arguable propositions. The 4,000 square mile metropolitan scale of the Chicago 2109 project causes many who first see it either to misunderstand or mischaracterize it. And just for frame of reference, what we're looking here, the top three drawings are plan drawings of the 7 county, northeastern Illinois counties, and the land coverage of buildings and you know, towns and suburbs, basically cities and suburbs, or actually before 1945, cities and towns. So on the left, the drawing on the left is what the land use patterns were in Chicago in 1936, when Chicago, even by then, had become a city of 3 million. In the center, what it looked like in 2009. And on the right, what's been proposed for 2109. Although you shouldn't think that we kind of went into this project thinking that that's what it would wind up looking like, but rather we came to some conclusions that it made sense for why it looked that way in the beginning and why it should look that way again. And then what you're seeing on the lower register is an aerial view looking west from the historic downtown center of Chicago at Chicago's sprawl environment. And what you're looking in 2009, and what you're looking at on the right is how the landscape starts to be recovered and encroach, you know, back into the city of Chicago. So let's see, where was I? Many who first see it either misunderstand or mischaracterize it, most commonly to mistake it for a latter-day Robert Moses-like political proposal entailing extensive condemnation of private property and forced shutdowns of post-1950 automobile suburbs. But this is not correct. Compared to the modernist planning hubris on display in metropolitan Chicago in the 1950s and 60s, Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109 is humility itself, and subsidiarity itself. How so? First, it proposes to take private land in neither city nor suburb and condemns no existing buildings. And second, although its narrative of the future is surely one of the decline and revival of Chicago, the decline it presumes is not wished for, but rather is simply already happening. And Chicago 2109 presumes that post-war automobile suburbs in their current form will have definitively failed by the beginning of the 22nd century, and primarily for 2 reasons. The first is demographic, related to consecutive generations of below replacement fertility rates in the industrialized world that carry certain fixed demographic consequences that will become increasingly apparent as the American baby boom generation dies off. The second, related to the first, is economic, having to do with maintenance and repair costs of post-1945 America's empire of far-flung suburban roads and sewers that far exceed the financial capacity of suburbia's low population density tax base. This is not to say our cities are currently in great shape either, only that the kinds of sustainable, resilient changes that Chicago 2109 imagines require us to do something different than what we are doing now. Chicago 2109 is therefore not to be understood as a single big plan to be imposed from on high, but rather as a visionary framework for 1,000 Chicago-related projects. Moreover, its fundamental sensibilities aren't necessarily modest. The 1909 plan of Chicago was conceived when Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world and rich. Chicago 2109 is conceived at a time of shrinkage and scarcity, not to mention environmental degradation, of which Chicago has a long history. Chicago 2109, therefore, demands an accumulation of prudential judgments. And so among these are, first, build on Chicago's existing strengths, especially rail transit and proximity to fresh water and good agricultural land. Cut suburban losses and redensify around commuter rail lines in known building and neighborhood types. Reclaim failed automobile suburbs as rural and agricultural landscape. Adopt form-based zoning codes to replace single-use zoning codes. In low-rise walk-up zoning districts, mandate by law a limited range of regionally sourced, low-embodied energy building materials: stone, brick, wood timbers, slate, and clay tiles, etc. More on that later. Create a fairer and more equitable regional regime of land taxation that rewards agricultural and entrepreneurial activity and increases housing supply and home ownership by eliminating speculation in land. And make land taxation supplemented by Pigouvian sin tax. Pigouvian taxes are well, sin taxes, but it's taxes on environmental waste, but any kind of sin tax is a Pigouvian tax, named after the French economist, I can't remember his first name, but Monsieur Pigou. Make land taxation supplemented by sin taxes foundational for governmental revenue at all levels, replacing as many other kinds of tax as possible, relying on them as supplemental only where necessary. What might this metropolitan scale transformation look like? Though modest about methods, the scope and ambition of Chicago 2109 are holistic and comprehensive, addressing issues ranging from land use, which we've seen a couple of those slides that we'll come back to settlement type, size, density, form, and structure. So what we're looking at here is a drawing of plan drawings at the top and aerial little axonometric drawings at the bottom of 4 different kinds of settlements: hamlets, villages, towns, and city neighborhoods. And they go from least dense, least area up to most dense, greatest area. And so it's a range. It's a range of settlement types and densities. There's a concern with that. There's a concern for regional transportation and its relationship to land use. And so this is, on the left, is a drawing of all the regional transportation, rail and interstate highway in metropolitan Chicago, and then the same for the city of Chicago, public transportation and interstates, and street network, of course. Then to storm and wastewater management. Chicago, about 10 miles west of Chicago, is a subcontinental divide, which means that on one side of it, water goes into Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes watershed and exits out the St. Lawrence Seaway into the North Atlantic, and on the other side it goes down eventually to the Illinois River and the Mississippi River and comes out to the Gulf of Mexico. Chicago is where it is because of that subcontinental divide. It's a connection point between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi watersheds. But it has created historic water problems. You may know or have heard that Chicago is famous for reversing the flow of the Chicago River. I lived in Chicago for 25 years before I understood what that meant and why it was done. And It's an interesting enterprise that has had mixed success and has ongoing environmental consequences, adverse environmental consequences that Chicago always attempts to solve by doing one more highly modern technological intervention. So this is something a little different. This proposes a two-tiered system of wastewater treatment. One is to use the one that exists in the region for the cities in the region, which is Chicago, and then 3 outlying cities, Joliet, Aurora, and Elgin. But then using constructed wetlands wastewater treatment to treat wastewater on site and return it into the ground as fresh water. If you want to talk about that later, we can do that. Let's see. Let's see. So it entails an attempt to recover in-city land that's lost to interstate highways, which you can see here. There's about 75 miles of interstate highways that were built. And again, if you think about the sort of the scale of intervention and hubris, this is really low down on that list, right? All of that land to make the freeways was condemned, and neighborhoods were moved. And now there's a single owner, and so the thought is that eventually that can be repurposed. Now we're not trying to get rid of interstate highways around the perimeter, but only within the city limits of Chicago. To historic regional housing types across a range of housing types, actually. So what you see here, you shouldn't be looking at these buildings in terms of their style. You should be looking at them in terms of that they go from left to right, top to bottom. Single family building, detached, single family house attached, 2 flats and 3 flats, 4 flats, 6 flats, 12 flats, 30-unit courtyard apartment buildings, buildings that have offices and apartments above a store, 6-story apartment buildings, 12-story apartment buildings, 16-story apartment buildings. So, again, it has less to do with style, but it has a lot to do with construction materials in terms of their durability, and so that's another issue. So the effects of these building types upon population density at the scale of a street, of a neighborhood street. So what you're seeing at the top here is a typical suburban street density that has about 2,800 people per square mile. It's single family houses on large lots. You see below in the center street section a Chicago railroad suburb that has about 7,000 people per square mile. In all the detached single-family houses with no accessory dwelling units or anything like that. And then below the Chicago street that has a density that is 4 times the suburban street. So this is with the same street section in 2- and 3-story buildings. You have 28,000 people per square mile. How can you get that in the same street section? Well, it's in the railroad suburb. The lots are 60 feet wide with a single-family house, and in the Chicago street section, the lots are 30 feet wide, and most of them had two flats and 3 flats on them. And so, but you get the same kind of street section in that because of those allowing those kinds of building types, which have largely been illegal since 1950. They're making a comeback, and the ones that were built are still there. So this density also is related to the recovery of natural and agricultural land at the scale of both the metropolitan region, right, which is this slide here. So again, on the left, you can see what the current land occupancy is in metropolitan Chicago, and on the right is what we imagine it to be in 2109 if all of the new settlements, all of the settlements in the form of hamlets and villages take place organized around the intersection of state and county roads, and if all of the towns are located around the existing railroad stops, and then in the city of Chicago, all of the building is located around the public transportation, right? So when you do that at the scale of the metropolitan region, you go from this on the left to this on the right, And when you do it at the scale of the city, right, you have on the left is the, within the city limits of Chicago, that's the city limits of Chicago and the amount of open land within the city limits of Chicago. But when you factor in or arrange land use according to the existence of existing public transportation, you get a Chicago that looks like this, that goes from having today, let's see, in 231 square miles, there are 222 square miles of that is occupied. In the 2109 proposal, in the 231 square miles, 166 square miles is occupied. So you're picking up, like 60 or 70 square miles within the city limits of Chicago. And then finally, the project deals with for lack of a better term, the symbolic content of Chicago's formal order itself, addressed by a proposal to establish a north-south sacred axis. Okay, so this is, north is up on this. So in the Burnham plan, this was the historic on the left. This east-west axis was a historic civic axis, but there was no place in the Burnham plan, no formal place in the overall plan of Chicago for acknowledgement of sacred order, which is something that has been characteristic of cities prior to the modern era. And so in our proposal, we want to make a cross-axis, a sacred cross-axis that runs north and south to this east-west civic axis. Now north is to the right, but this would be the sacred axis, and it would be a boulevard that would be fronted by religious institutions that are prominent, buildings of religious communities prominent within the city of Chicago. And then this is that proposed new, this is what it looks like in an aerial view where, let's see, I can't lost the cursor here, but you can see the city hall here on this axis, on the civic axis, and you can see the cross axis of the sacred axis that runs across that. Now, the intent, right, of course, is that is to give places of prominence for representative houses of worship from Chicago's existing religious communities. And it's also, though, at the same time, a physical embodiment in the public realm of America's historic principles of religious free exercise and non-establishment. This proposal is obviously more rooted in both Dignitatis Humanae, which is the Vatican II encyclical on religious freedom, as well as certain traditions of American liberalism, than it is in any integralist aspiration. And I suppose that my view of integralism is that it's properly regarded, and I'm not unsympathetic to integralism, but I think that it's properly regarded as an eschatological condition rather than a possible historic achievement, at least at the scale of a city as diverse as Chicago is. So the second project that I want to show is vastly smaller in scale, and it is at the scale of the parish, and I say with respect to integralism, at the scale of a metropolis, it's difficult in the modern world. At the scale of a parish and neighborhood block, that's a different matter. And so I want to close with a coda that illustrates how the same concerns that motivated the proposal for Metropolitan Chicago's scale, that motivated the proposal for Metropolitan Chicago, how that scales down to the local neighborhood. The Chicago 2109 project engages 4,000 square miles of Northeast Illinois and is a product of multiple design studios over several years. The second project that I'm about to show engages a mere 8 acres on the southwest edge of downtown South Bend, Indiana, and is the work of class of 2023 graduate students Patrick Beck, Shawnee Prayam Sikder, and Sam Usley in one design studio over the course of 6 weeks. So it's, I think the contrast can hardly be starker. The students came to the project with prior studio experience of exercises designing small schematic urban interventions, but none requiring design work that was constrained by real-world zoning codes, let alone the more daunting task of differentiating good zoning codes from bad zoning codes. Nevertheless, for a 6-week schematic exercise, the student work was meticulous in addressing project details down to and including zoning, site subdivision and parcelization, and provision of interior block off-street parking in a new neighborhood precinct that simultaneously diminishes the need for driving. So this is the site. And you can see it's 8 acres. You've got St. Patrick's Church here, St. Hedwig's Church here. There's a rectory here and a rectory over here. And then you've got these 1960s buildings that have basically outlived their useful life. But you've got all of this vacant land in these 8 acres. So the existing site is a classic 1960s era urban renewal ruin. And the studio project was imagined as a model for the development of underused church properties. Simultaneously modest and audacious, it proposes a small neighborhood precinct around 2 existing late 19th century churches located a block apart and standing virtually alone on their 8-acre church-owned property. On the vacant land surrounding the churches, the students have proposed to fill it with 60 to 100 new mission-related dwelling units, for example, for school personnel, because there's a school that's on the site that's part of it, a thriving school. Mission-related dwelling units, for example, for school personnel, married university students, etc., in a variety of small but elegant and durable buildings designed to accommodate an on-site gross residential population density of 7.5 to 12.5 dwelling units per acre, which is the density that I described in those settlement types, the density of a town, of a small town. So it's a little larger than a village, but really not as dense as a denser town. So so it accommodates this 60 to 100 dwelling units, which comes out to 7.5 to 12.5 dwelling units per acre. Plus recreational fields and a 40,000 square foot K through 12 school in 2 buildings for an existing Catholic classical academy that's currently housed in one of those 60s buildings that's fallen down. So in addition to that, for the school buildings, 11,000 square feet of retail space, and perhaps most importantly, a sequence of internal block public spaces that altogether comprise a beautiful neighborhood precinct that highlights the presence and seeks to revive the fortunes of the 2 churches, now 1 parish, and their larger neighborhood context. So we had some alumni who came in for a weekend workshop with the 3 students, and they looked at a variety of precedents for interior block development. And so one of the precedents, this is Thomas Doherty wrote this book about the American alley, and also, on the left is an alley, on the right is an interior block configuration from Flanders. So this is the scale of alley development, alley residential development. This is the scale of what's in Flanders is called God's houses, they're almshouses. So on the lower left is the interior view, on the upper left is the plan view, and on the right is the aerial view. And this is the scale of the God's house, right, of that courtyard interior block development at the same scale as the 8-acre site. Right? So you look at how big all of the other buildings are on the site, and they're standing alone, as opposed to the buildings in this interior block settlement that actually are making space. And they're small buildings, they're small square footage, but they're beautiful and they're durable. They're 400 years old. And so because they've been built well, they've lent themselves to being renovated. So those are all precedent studies. And then regarding those small houses, another of our graduates did this study for the adaptation of the God's house idea in 900 square foot dwelling units on 20 feet by 30 foot parcel footprints. So basically you've got 600 square feet on the ground floor and 300 square feet above. And then another of our alums came in and did a little workshop on masonry bearing wall construction. And also we paid a visit to the American College of Building Arts in Charleston, South Carolina, that among other things gives Bachelor of Arts degrees in School of Building Trades. And one of the majors is timber framing, and another one of the majors is masonry construction. So this is all durable construction. And then this is the student work, and I'll run through it quickly. It includes a demolition plan and then a four-phase site build-out, right? So this is these are the existing 1960s buildings to be demolished, as indicated. You can see where the two churches are. This is the master plan development phase 1, where the objective is to make a complete street, a complete enclosed, linear, spatial, focused environment with a visual connection between the two churches, right? And so you get a little sense of what that looks like. This is that same plan view from this location. You get a view of St. Hedwig's, down the street. Phase 2 is the perimeter build out to the edge of the existing block, as shown here. And they developed, actually very conventional, building types, again, with using good materials, of row houses and, special blocks at the perimeter that hold the edge of the street and also define the interior blocks of the street. Then phase 3, after they did the first complete street and did the perimeter building, they created a series of internal block infill that included housing within the center of the block and completion of the elementary school. And these are views from that perspective views of with the plan view below it at the bottom, showing the point of view of the perspective. And then this is one looking to the northwest, and again you can see it zeroes in on the church spire of St. Hedwig's on that streetscape. And then this one is actually looking due west down the alley of this development here. And then phase 4 is the final build out of the high school over here and its athletic facilities. So I have to say they did a really thorough job of not only considering what the building types were, the spatial character of what they were making, but also dealing with all the pragmatic things like zoning, parcelization, and off-street parking. It was really, I think it's a remarkable project. Now, actually, so I'm gonna end with they also made a fly-through video of that. So let's see if I can make this work. Maybe I can. Let's see. So just remember here, everything you see except for the two churches is new. And I don't have volume, so what do I do? Yep. In the context of South Bend's market-driven and a proactive city-facilitated development program, this project afforded students an opportunity to explore how ecclesiastical landowners, by virtue of their nonprofit status, and recognizing that virtually every property-owning religious community in the United States is a potential community land trust that, with good design guidance, has the ability to make modest, high-quality, below market rate, mission-related housing. And how such communities might be able to develop their underused properties differently from current industry standard models of financing and development. They show how religious communities, by being conscientious about the use of their land and adopting a big picture approach to design and construction, possess the opportunity to remake village, town, and city neighborhood precincts incrementally by multiple actors in ways that enable parish and congregational communities to better fulfill their evangelical, pastoral, charitable, familial, artistic, educational, and entrepreneurial callings in ways simultaneously productive, beautiful, and didactic. The trajectories of secularist culture, the global economy, hypermodern architecture, and suburban sprawl increasingly appear spiritually, economically, environmentally, and anthropologically unsustainable. And no one involved with these projects thinks achieving either the regional goals of Chicago 2109 or the parish and neighborhood goals of the South Bend project will be easy. However, Christians need not agree with Pope Francis's political prescriptions in Laudato Si to recognize the theological and anthropological truths at its heart. That nature is most truly understood as creation, that man is an intermediate being with a duty to steward nature, with implications for both nature and for us, and that everything is connected. In this world, walkable mixed-use villages, towns, and city neighborhoods are the primary historic ways that human animals employ productive and practical reason to occupy the landscape well. If human beings are to live harmoniously in, with, and from nature, both frugally and abundantly, it will likely be in these physical forms of community. In such traditional settlements, just and generous communities create economic, social, and spiritual capital, manage their adjacent landscapes well, make durable and beautiful buildings, and locate the most important of them in places of honor. Such physical patterns elevate everyone, and Christians can begin to recover them today, even in small parishes and congregations, and of course, not only Christians. Any small community of any size can become part of a polis, that earthly community of communities that Aristotle identified as the highest community because it exists to promote human flourishing, which for Aristotle was the highest good human beings can achieve in this life. An estimation of the city of man that even Augustine endorsed insofar as it promoted, quote, the end, the telos, the fini of earthly peace. But Augustine also knew what all Christians should also know, that our best earthly cities anticipate and may even in some mysterious way participate in that larger urban cosmic telos that is the city of God. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Bass, and Ivan. It's open for questions, so we have like 10 minutes for questions.
And I can stay as long as you
So I don't know if we've already, I will start just saying something that we probably already discussed a little bit on the podcast that we recorded together a couple of months ago. So with a smile, I could say that video reminded me of Europe. Like it just looks like a little European village. As you already wrote, including I think in the description of this song, the environment and the cities which we live do not determine or cause our happiness and flourishing. But there is a correlation. because the Austin Institute deals with social sciences and number and statistics, I was wondering, are there statistics that show that by improving, like,
right?
Yeah.
This is kind of architects, because architecture is an art and not a science, that have, I'd say too many architects, but for understandable reasons, envy scientists, and so there are all kinds of reasons that come forth for why traditional settlements are better, but they're, it usually has something to do with neuroscience is one of the big things that it may well be the case that we're, our brains are wired to do things in a certain way. I don't doubt it, but it doesn't really it doesn't address the issue, I think, of settlements being products of communities, right, and practices that have existed for a long time, that have had a long time to develop and can both evolve and devolve. And so my assessment, and I'm not alone in this, is that the current state of the built environment has devolved, but it's systemic, because it's related to where our building materials come from, how far they're shipped, what their environmental effects are, both locally and where they come from. But these are, in some ways, the interesting thing about studying cities is that all of these things come into play, right? I like to tell new architecture students, that particularly those who come from some other discipline, that there's no knowledge that's not germane to architectural knowledge, but the objective of an architectural education is to get students to start thinking like architects. And so thinking like architects, it's primarily focused on form, right? But you can't just focus on form. That's one of the interesting things about it as a vocation, right? Is that it requires you to engage so many other kinds of issues. Aristotle says that the best life for human beings is the life of moral and intellectual virtue lived in community with others, so far as we have material goods to make it possible, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. So the material goods piece is not the essence of the good life. It's virtue, but virtue requires what Aristotle called external goods. And I would say that the Chicago project is about the external goods. The South Bend project is about it's about the community, right? It's about the sense of, it's about the place, right, that the community has the opportunity to make. Doesn't think they're going to do it, but the Chicago project, it just covers all of those kinds of environmental and economic and infrastructural issues that make it easier to live well, that make it easier to live a life in community with others than environments that make it harder. It doesn't guarantee it, right? And you can live in a good city and be a bad person. So, yeah.
First of all, I just want to thank you for your very talk. I think there's a lot to think about the scope and the kind of large scale vision of these two students. It's inspiring and very exciting. But I guess my question is related to something a little bit smaller scale, which is what advice do you have for people, for those of us, especially who don't have a background in urban planning or architecture? What advice do you have for those of us who are trying to make the most of the cities that we live in?
No, it's a great question. So designers are, as much as designers like to think that we're the most important people in a project, buildings, both individual buildings and their collection, settlements are cooperative enterprises, right? So they depend upon, even those who don't really think about it much, but recognize, have a good feel, right, for being in a neighborhood, you know, you can, even without any architectural knowledge, you can get a kind of vibe about what's an energetic and good place to be and what's not. But I would say, you know, that the design professions and the engineering professions, they address the nuts and bolts of that in terms of design as an art, but also in terms of, you know, even when you design something, you have to put real measurements on it. You have to deal with real materials. So, but you can have a huge effect. You can have a huge effect as a patron, right? I mean, the history is full of people who made a lot of money and you know, supported, had the ambition to make good places. They don't always do that well. Famously, Brad Pitt's little experiment down in New Orleans, which hired a bunch of hypermodernist architects to replace the houses that were destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and they were built in sort of hay-wow architecture that didn't last 5 years. Didn't even last 5 years. They were had to be torn down. But this is not to pick on Brad Pitt, because it's just the culture that we have does not lend itself. It does not encourage and promote the kind of work that I've shown. So I do want to. I agree with Max Weber. It's a slow, boring, and hard work. It's a long-term cultural project. It is absolutely a project that, you know, if you're interested in design professions, you can give your life to. And it is possible to move the needle. Nobody was doing this stuff. No school would have done this kind of stuff when I was in school. There were not firms, there were not jobs that even aspired to do this kind of work. And the fact is today that there are firms that aspire to do this kind of work, but they can't, right? Because they don't have the right clients, because they don't have the right building culture. I will say, I think that I ponder this a lot. And this is a question I raised to my students, what's the kind of environment in which they could live and have a life doing architecture the way that we teach them how to do architecture? And I think that the answer to that is that it needs to be, I have two thoughts on it. One is you need to work for institutions that are intending to be around for the long run, right? Who have really no incentive other than foolishness to not build well, right? Because it costs a little bit, it costs more to build well. But boy, you know, there are schools that just waste a whole lot of money on building buildings by star architects that fall apart, you know, within, you know, immediately. Actually, the repairs start immediately. So it's a cultural problem. But you know, you got to think that you got to look. There are institutions out there that want to be there, you know, for the long term. One would hope that churches are that kind of institution. They're sadly, rarely is that the case. And then the other is, I tell students to go, if they're looking to have that kind of life, to find some place, and my dean completely disagrees with me about this. My dean wants our graduates to go be world leaders and, you know, go to international cities. And my advice to students is that, you know, go to those places to work and get your credentials. But then if you want to have a life in a place that makes this kind of, you know, this kind of stuff, is that you find some place that existed prior to 1945 that may have sprawled in the interim, that has a main street with good bones and maybe some vacant lots, and go in and buy a storefront, or go in and, you know, buy a vacant lot and somehow get the financing to build one building. You know, I mean, it won't be easy necessarily to get the bank to finance that, because it's not. That's another problem, is financing, because financing has to do with big scale projects. I'm sure it's the case here in Austin. Things don't get built lot by lot by lot. They get built block by block. But all the places that we love were built on blocks, lot by lot by lot, by different people, by different designers. So try to find a place like that that's below the radar. You know, have a family, have kids, be part of the community, be a kind of developer, builder, architect, and do one building a year. And in 40 years, start doing more, but you'll have had a measurable impact in the community and be part of the community, and it'll be a better place.
Yeah, you're in a city that is growing quite rapidly and seems to have some strains about its growth, as I understand from the city. So that, lots and lots of people are moving in. Students, as I understand it, feel like there just needs to be more housing available. And housing prices are now at the level of Santa Monica, meaning a smallish bungalow for $2.1 million, which puts it completely out of the range of like what anybody. And of course, and as you see, and I've noticed this, not having been in Austin for a long time, what's happening, of course, is Austin is not no longer weird, right? It's pretty standard in the sense of glass towers eating up the city. Because of course it's like, well, so do you have any advice, I guess would be the point, for Austin as it grows and develops? And would you say, well, look, you are going a certain route that all these other cities have gone. And if you want to do it the right way, here's what you should do.
Interesting question and a lot of facets to it. Just by way of comparison, what's Austin growing about? Is it growing like 60,000 people a decade or something like that? I don't know.
50,000 people a year.
60,000 people.
50,000 a year.
50,000 a year.
150 people a day.
Well, that's really interesting because Chicago, between 1880 and 1930, grew by 600,000 people a decade, which was so 60,000 people a year for 50 years. And so remember that drawing, that slide that I showed of all the different housing types? All of those things were being built lot by lot, block by block, in Chicago at the time that it was growing at that pace. So we have different methods of financing. We have very different building culture. We have a different architectural culture. Although one of the reasons that I chose the topic to show, the Chicago project, is because I'm aware that Austin is growing, right? And Chicago is a precedent for the Burnham plan was a response to that growth, and it's if the question is how does that change, I don't know how. I guess what I would say if I were telling students, I'm not sure that I would say, if what you want to build is traditional architecture and urbanism, and you want to do it in Austin, it's probably not the place to go. Just because it's so much part of the international global economy now. It's a great place to live and do something else, but I don't see that changing, short of a kind of just a contraction of the global economy, which a lot of people are predicting. But you can't really predict the future except demographically.
So Austin's doing.
I don't know. Austin has assets, so I don't say it's doomed. Grace shows up, but it's not. I believe me. I just looking around. I've been here less than 24 hours, and I see the amount of construction that's going on and what it looks like. And so it's not. It's what these projects are attempting to get back.
Well, firstly, I enjoyed a lot of what you were saying. I think it was late, but on the same topic as a gentleman here, I am curious how what you described here, the Chicago might relate to Austin. And being born and raised and being in the construction industry here in town, I'm seeing directly and every day in and out, what I've been heard being called the building doom loop, which, from what I can gather in my ignorance, is it's the profit-driven construction and design firms that are building less and less quality buildings like you were describing, plain and brick and something that will last. They're cutting corners, and that's being bounced back and forth between overburdened and overwhelmed building departments. And so the building departments are putting more and more strict regulations on the builders and people are building, and then they're cutting more corners to make more profits. And so it's this housing doom, building doom cycle. And how, if any plans or what you're describing with Chicago might stop that, or at least slow, stop, or ideally turn that around.
Well, Randy was maybe throwing me a softball about the cost of housing, which is directly related to speculation in land. And so there have been historical periods in the U.S. where the idea of the land value tax has been floated out there. You don't tax buildings. You replace a property tax with a land value tax. So instead of taxing land and buildings, you just tax the land, which means that everybody gets an abatement, a tax abatement on buildings. People who own vacant lots have to pay the same freight that people who own lots with buildings on. So that's an idea that has been marginal for a long time. But boy, if you Google land value tax and millennials, there are land value tax memes out there. I mean, it's the city of Detroit is seriously contemplating adopting the land value tax. So it's an idea that's very much out there. So that's one aspect, one possibility. The question about I was talking about institutions that tend to be around for a while. So here's something that would actually improve the quality of construction instantly if a community was sufficiently bound up as a community to adopt it, which would be to adopt as part of the building code a limit on the materials that can be used, right? So I have a friend, a colleague, and that's easier to do, for like a college or university or something like that. None of them do it, or few of them do it. Notre Dame doesn't do it. But the idea would be, and a colleague who wrote it up as a one-page building code called the Dumb Code. And the basic idea was that all buildings had to be masonry-bearing wall buildings, employing timber, heavy timber framing, slate tile roofs, slate or clay tile roofs, no steel reinforcing except in seismic zones, no concrete, no Portland cement concrete, but I'm blanking on the. Yeah, I don't know. It's a high line border, right? So because it's got a low coefficient of expansion. So, but the point is that if you required people to build like that, there would be a vertical limit to how high they could go. It would be probably easily 4 stories, but maximum 6. You would have a limit to how far you can span, right? Your windows would become vertical, right? Because they either have to be carried by a stone lintel or a timber lintel, and you could throw those materials down on the site, and unskilled laborers could build something that would be kind of rough, but it would work because they have to use the materials and compression that they have, right? And the second time they did it, they get better, and the third time they get better, and after they've done it 4 or 5 times, the good ones start competing with each other for little flourishes. They learn how to make an arch, right? And so this actually is a kind of microcosm of how building cultures were established. It's the ability in some ways to span any distance with any material, not with any material, but with the number of materials that are available on the market that are, the advantage of the kinds of materials that my colleague was describing for the Dumb Code is that they're very low embodied energy buildings. The materials are low embodied energy because they come from very close to the earth. There's relatively little finishing that has to be done, to stone, or then you have to fire clay to get bricks. But there are certainly communities that could adopt something like that, and they would start to have a traditional building culture. But in the kind of market economy that we have, I don't see it as a widespread thing.
obstruct and that developers.
I'm naive, maybe. I don't understand why there would not be a market for well-built buildings where what developers are being paid for is their labor to oversee the construction of such buildings. I mean, contractors, they build in their fee. I would think that the labor, again, I'm naive about this. I mean, this is, but
I see what you're saying. It seems like right now the developers are buying land, paying for materials, and making all the profits, where you're talking about more than taking a third, fourth party, just kind of like Austin Energy did when they accepted that solar and alternative energies were taking over. They need to be more the maintaining it, and so that
anyway, it's what we call in some circles a cluster.
So we have one question here, and then I would say one more there.
So, give or take about a decade ago into like the later 2010s, I did a fair amount of activism around issues related to land use, urban design, all that kind of stuff. And what I really found, and this is partially just, I think, my own views on the subject don't necessarily line up neatly with any large faction in those debates. But then a lot of the time you would sort of end up with kind of these dueling camps where you essentially have kind of the conservative-ish type people who essentially want to pour more resources into the status quo of, suburban style car development, which is not really sustainable, and a lot of people don't realize is the result of, various forms of social engineering 80, 90 years ago. And then you have another kind of urbanisty faction who would be somewhere between, who would be sort of foolish in many, many ways, and could, see them essentially, even if you agreed with some of the theoretical arguments they make in the real world, you could see them blundering us into the type of 15-minute cities that the World Economic Forum wants us to all live in. And you just get these like impassioned but completely irrational arguments between these two various dueling sides. And how do you get out of that completely counterproductive, accomplishing nothing sort of situation?
I don't think so. The best built environments that we know of, the most durable, that have been around for the longest time, they were built under conditions of scarcity. And we live in a culture that aspires to unlimited abundance. And I'm not sure that it's possible for any community of people to make a good place who don't have, who either are not constrained by reality or voluntarily constrain themselves, their desires. I think that so it really does involve, I think, a kind of self-limitation, voluntary or imposed by reality. So it's a cultural problem.
I've seen that a lot of like kind of mixed use places kind of like the reappearing or like we're developing them or like renovating neighborhoods, and like a big like critique about them is like gentrification, kind of like unethical like building or like development. So like I don't know, how do we combat that and make sure it's all ethical?
So I would say that the gentrification thing is related to the issue of land value, because the value of land increases really based on the population that lives on it, right? So if you have greater population density, the value of the land goes up. And so right now, that land, the value of that land is captured by individual landowners, and landlords. And so the idea of a land value tax is that you should tax land at a higher rate, and 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 make it at least revenue neutral, right? So do you eliminate other taxes? So you replace the sales tax, you replace the property tax, you replace ideally the income tax. Because an income tax is a tax on labor, you get less of it. An income tax on sales, affects commerce, you get less of it. An income tax on capital gains discourages investment. But when you raise the tax on land, you're not diminishing the supply of land. And land is a kind of code word for natural resources, right? And so the idea is that you should tax the natural resources that arguably are commonwealth, right? Commonwealth, and that's how you should fund public services. So that the effect of gentrification is that as places get better, rents do rise, but they rise slowly, right? And so the problem with the way that our property tax system works is that it makes the cycle it's a cycle of speculation, right? I mean, economists have charted this. It's like every 17 years or so there's a bust. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to end on a positive note. So,
Me too.
Go ahead. So, thank you for that presentation on both the Chicago one and the parishes as well. I would just preface it by saying I share your Christian worldview in the way that we should steward our built environment. And I see a lot of churches that look like that in Austin with a lot of vacant land. I have one myself that we're contemplating doing something like that. But I just want to know as we end, and leave on a positive note, you in the academia world, the research world, your influence and sphere of influence of students and at Notre Dame, what hope and inspiration and encouragement do you see in an increasingly secular world that we live in, of people wanting and desiring to live in places and work in places like you displayed, which is very counter to how many people in America live. But we all travel to Europe and we see the Begenhof in Amsterdam, which I thought was very modeled in that design. But what hope and inspiration do you see from your purview that people want to live in these models of the way that God told us to live amongst one another?
Well, I mean, first thing to say is our hope is in the Lord, right? So, but I think with respect to our students, architecture students, not all of them, but a whole lot of them are highly idealistic. Right? They want to change the world. They want to make the world better. And making the world better is not, it's not simply due to good intentions, right? And they're particularly with respect to architecture and design. It requires some skills, and it requires it requires really an engagement with the tradition, with a good tradition, right? Where you learn. I mean, one of the things. I mean, I'll just say that most students who come into architecture school anywhere, but also at Notre Dame, they come to architecture school because they want to make buildings, right? And they think of buildings as isolated, freestanding objects, and it takes a year or two of teaching them to think about buildings in ensembles that shape public space, and that the history of cities is really the history of public space. The public space is where it's where the culture of the city takes place, and so so that's a big change of mindset. But so I have a lot of hope for students that I've had. I've had a lot of, for 20 years I've had some I'm grateful for them. They're doing good work. So the harvest is great.
Well, on a positive and hopeful note, I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Professor Best, and I want to thank you for the attention. I think that related to the name that we have, you mentioned how buildings in the past would last for generations. Normal if you have kids, right? Like if you have kids and your kids don't move and you have grandkids, you want your house to last. But in the single word of today, we don't need buildings to last. Thank you. This was less positive. I'm sorry. We can go back.
Thank you.
But thank you.